Hey, everybody.
Hello.
Hi.
Everyone, as a reminder, if you could please register your attendance and meeting notes doc, which I just pasted into the chat. And look at the agenda. We could start by first welcoming any new members. If you'd like to say hi. Do the list right now.
Hi, I'm a new member. My name is Mikey. I met some of you on the OpenSSF day.
Hi, welcome. Thanks for joining. Anybody else? All right, great. I think Mike had the first agenda item. I guess I get, well, yeah, okay. Yeah, Mike had the first agenda item. You want to
go? Sure, yeah, and I'll try and keep it relatively short. There is, 1 second here, let me pull this back up. Got a lot of great feedback at Open Source Summit, both OpenSSF Day as well as the rest of the summit. I'll create an issue in GitHub with some of that feedback when I get a chance. There was some, one of the biggest, I think, pieces of interesting feedback was there was some pushback from some folks who were more like older school open source developers on the building local versus building hosted. And one of the reasons being is they said, hey, look, it's gonna be hard to convince folks that like hosted is better than a laptop or something like that when you have a lot of bad actors in the build space. So and in particular, I know the Travis situation was brought up a couple of times where a lot of folks are like, hey, you can't convince me that anything built on Travis the past few years is in any way safe. And so I thought that was an interesting piece of feedback. I think generally, still what we have there makes sense, but I do think that maybe we have some additional clarifications and the way that they said we should be framing it is it's more about knowing where something was built, right? It's hard to know where something was built if it was built on somebody's laptop versus CI, and that is in many ways more important than necessarily purely the security of the CI tool. But anyway, there's some interesting stuff on that front. Folks are before I move on, Mark.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm just writing notes real quick. Yeah, I think two kind of quick thoughts on that. I think it's completely legitimate feedback. Well, I mean, I guess all feedback is, but like that's a point well taken. Another thing that we could maybe focus on is like from the individual team or individual person's perspective, that's a totally legit answer, right? It probably is more secure because like they run it themselves, but it's more about the consumers. Like if I consume things from like 1,000 different vendors, I don't want to have to trust 1,000 different things, even if it makes sense for them individually. So that's probably one thing we could talk about. Another is it just kind of to highlight reproducible builds is a great answer for here, because then they could build it on their laptop and you could build it on CI, and you could trust, either. So that's something that maybe we could go directionally as a group. Yeah, Andrew.
Yeah, I actually just had a conversation about hosted builds today with some other folks. And the point that I was trying to arrive at is that if you have something running on somebody's hardware, that it's a lot easier for it to be compromised because there doesn't have to be a pivot involved. And so it just is an individual compromise that would then compromise the build system. Whereas if something is hosted, and again, it doesn't have to be hosted on some external service, it could be hosted on some internal service if you're concerned about things being outside the firewall, that there at least has to be some pivot, which would require some credentials to be able to be retrieved from the system which is compromised, instead of just the system being compromised and then the builds immediately being able to be compromised. And I think that another key point about it being hosted is that it's enabled to be reused for multiple different artifact builds. And that goes with the corollary, or there's the principle of trusting systems and verifying artifacts, and its corollary of limiting the amount of trusted systems. What might be the concern is more with Travis, because of the issues that have happened with Travis. And I don't know if there's been any indication from the Travis, from those that are running Travis, whether there's a desire to start attesting to some SLSA level, but maybe that's not the best example to include in there. And maybe we can have something else. I think it was included in there to indicate that it is a service, as something that's in addition to GitHub and Google Cloud Build.
Yeah, no, I agree there, and I think there's definitely areas we can, I think, clarify some stuff, whether it's in blogs or something like that, just on like why we are sort of viewing the build service as something separate from the hosted. And I think a lot of it really does come down to, yeah, you can, and this, I know this was, to what Joshua has said, is on the NPM RFC, there was some pushback like, hey, why is my laptop not good enough? And I think it has less to do with whether or not you've completely secured your laptop. It has more to do with both what you said there, right, Andrew, which is like, if I'm running on a laptop, it's much easier to compromise a single laptop than to compromise an entire build system generally. And it's also probably easier to prove that the build system is secure than to say, hey, this, my MacBook that I carry around with me on planes and go wherever and so on is a little bit different than, something that's hosted on, whether it's the cloud or in a data center or whatever. And then, but with that said, I think that there's definitely areas we can kind of, I think the big thing which you highlighted there is you get the visibility into, this is a build service. This is one thing that I now need to keep track of, as opposed to if everybody was building on their laptops, I would need to keep track of the security of, 10,000 different services. Or 10,000 different build services where those build services are other people's laptops. Okay, so that was one big piece of feedback. And I think actually, in fact, somebody who, I'm blanking on his name, but he was from AWS, and he was originally, he said he was an old school Apache person, and said, when it's gonna be hard to convince a lot of the sort of Apache Foundation folks that building off of their laptop is insecure, but building, from a known place is often much better than just building off an unknown place, and then the unknown place being somebody's, laptop.
And what you said originally, maybe focusing on like the wording of like, we're not saying like the laptop is insecure, but rather it's easier for us to gain confidence in it, right? Like,
yeah, exactly.
You know where
Exactly.
it came from.
Yeah. Folks were also asking for more examples. So in particular, folks were asking for more from like a threat model perspective of, these are the threats that we're trying to mitigate using SLSA. And then like, here are literal examples of those threats. So a good question that had been brought up by, it was a bit of a clickbaity question, but I reckon it is actually pretty good because from a discussion point, Josh Bressers had brought up, hey, what sorts of threats are you actually dealing with here? Because like, for example, if we take SolarWinds, right, how would SLSA have prevented SolarWinds and those sorts of things? I think is an interesting sort of question. Not just that, but like all those, like if we have the box around the arrows and the build, like the input from the source dependencies, et cetera, what sorts of things should SLSA prevent, detect, et cetera? That should be something there. Jay?
Yeah, and I think a lot of these questions are coming off the back of the clarity around whether this is a security framework, compliance requirements, or whether we're specing some type of conformance. And I think what's happening is, when we say a matter of compliance and we're saying that or with saying maturity model, we're saying compliance requirements, we're saying security framework. Well, hell, say security framework, there are going to be those that ask, well, what are the threats that we're trying to mitigate? What's the threat model, right? You're going to have those questions. You're saying it's a maturity model, but then you're going to have those respective maturity levels, which of course we do levels 1 through 3 at this point. Then if you say it's compliance requirements, well, then you're going to have those requirements in place. And then of course, because this isn't because we don't have an auditing, and we're still trying to work that part out. But since this isn't being audited by a third party, you do have to tie it back into something that is. So a lot of these questions are coming up because I don't know that we're clear enough on what this is, and then putting out the justification or the right subsequent information that's tied to what we're saying this is. So that's the only reason why I see these kind of questions coming up. And Josh, that's a good question. I'm with Mike on this one. I didn't think Josh was being malicious in this question. I think he was providing an avenue for us to quell some of the questions that he might be getting or others might be getting out there. So I did appreciate the question, and I appreciate how we answered that question in the moment.
The quick question on that. When we talk about the examples, we have the threats page that kind of goes into detail. Could you talk briefly about like the delta between that and what they're looking for?
Yeah. So the feeling I got was two things. One is some of it is, I think, in how we communicate it as well, which is more for the positioning group. Because some of it I feel like was a bit like, hey, I haven't read the docs. What's the 2-second pitch? But in addition to that, one of the things that like after having conversations afterwards, one of the things that people seem to sort of indicate, and this is something that we had done with Fresca a while back, was like almost like if let's say we have the new npm SLSA builder in GitHub and yada yada. Could you create could we and this is maybe for the tooling group, could we create a couple of examples of within collaboration, obviously with the spec here, could we create a couple of this is what a malicious example looks like, and here is why it doesn't work? Because I think a lot of folks are just getting confused. They're like, oh, I see all this stuff, but I think, and this is something that actually came out of the talk I gave that gave the deep dive, which was like, Salsa will, like the key piece, and it's important that people recognize this, that Salsa can be used to generate malware, but what Salsa can't be done is you can't, like, if you are Salsa level 3, it's much harder to lie about you generating malware. Like you go back and you're like, wait a second, I was told I was pulling in these things, but the build actually seemed to have been pulling in a bunch of other stuff. Or the, I was told the build ran these commands, but this thing, when the GitHub generator or whatever recorded these other commands. So what happened there? I think that's where Salsa is coming in.
Yeah, and in fact, yeah, this is a good point. I wanted to do this for like a year now, and I think like we talked about, I think we might have an open issue about this. I think Joshua and I and maybe someone else from VMware talked about doing this a while back, like basically a Salsa playground or something like that, where like you could actually see a registry and like try things of like, there's this policy in place, try uploading it, it gets rejected. You do build this way, it gets rejected. I really think that would help a lot, and that would go a very, very, very long way to explaining. I think another thought is the current threats page is like very, very detailed and low level because it's trying to be exhaustive. It probably would be good to have a more narrative talk that's like, well, why do you need Salsa? Like, well, here's the type of things that it would attack, prevent. Like, let's say you're a company. One of the engineers' machines is compromised, and even though you have checked in code, here's the, their build machine is used to like deploy malicious things to prod, and this is how it gets checked or something, and kind of walk through like the main attacks that we're worried about. That would also probably, I think, help a lot.
So I think we could have some blog post about this. I mean, it doesn't have to be in the spec, right?
I think official documentation would be pretty helpful, because we already have the threats overview page. I think if we make that less about like, here's like a list of A example, B example, C example, but make it a little bit more narrative of like, here's an example source to prod pipeline, or publishing software, some kind of example scenario, and say like, well, here's where things could go wrong, and kind of do it. That I think could be valuable.
Yeah, I'm happy to see it, but I must admit that my first reactions, I'm not convinced, but I keep an open mind. I mean, I'll tell you my challenge is, it's important in specifications that we don't say the same thing in two different ways where you can introduce discrepancies, right? So even though the spec might be a bit too compact for everybody to comprehend all the gory details, there's value in keeping it concise. And that's why I say, well, you can always add blog posts and whatnot, because then there is no issue. If there's a discrepancy, the spec is the last, is the law.
Right. Well, I think another point is like we have normative and informative sections.
Yes.
And so I think we have a little bit more leeway in the informative section.
Yeah, that I agree. If we clearly label this as informational, then I agree. Then that's no problem. And by the way, one other feedback we got already is, it's pretty clear to me that there is confusion already between Salsa version, Salsa levels, and tracks. We got some question that made that very clear during the panel.
Yeah, and there was also some folks had pointed out a few things recently on that, and I think somebody had called something Salsa version 4 when they meant Salsa level 4, and yeah, there was a good deal of confusion on some of those. Yeah. yeah, Salsa v4 requires, yeah, it's somebody, you know, so I think that there's some stuff that, you know, I think as time goes on, it'll get better. And I think there's nothing we could really do to fix all the issues. But yeah.
Yeah, please do file that, because I think that is, I mean, it's something we worried about when choosing version numbers, right? Of like VN. I worried about that. And so I don't know about how everyone else feels, but I feel like if that's causing confusion, we could just use a different scheme for versioning, right? Like,
No, as Mike said, I think people may get the right mental model eventually. I don't know. I haven't had a chance to look at the spec again to see whether we're clear on how those things are. But it's almost like maybe having a graphic that shows the 3 dimensions, version, tracks, and levels can be helpful. But as Mike said, also, a lot of people clearly haven't read the spec yet. So images, you know, from what they heard, they kind of infer some model, which is wrong. And then it's just a matter of giving them the time to catch up with what's really there.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, I think some of it will, as actually that ties into my next thing, is a few folks had also been saying they sort of recommended that maybe we have, through something like the OpenSSF, a couple of webinars, you know, let's say over a handful, like, you know, over a month or something like that, you know, we have a handful of webinars on Salsa so that folks can just sort of join like a meeting like this, but just something that's published a little bit more, something that has, you know, let's say a handful of presentations on what Salsa is, maybe the Salsa tooling, you know, that sort of thing. And then also open up for questions. So that folks who are kind of like learning, you know, because the thing that we also got feedback on is a lot of folks are learning about Salsa through a number of different reasons. You know, some devs who were there were like, yeah, you know, an executive told me about this Salsa thing that they heard about and they wanted me to learn about it. Some folks are devs who are just like, yep, I, you know, learned about it through, you know, some blog or whatever. And other folks are coming in through a number of other means. And so I think folks are interested in seeing something like a webinar that can, you know, where they can learn about Salsa in kind of more of a, you know, less formal sort of, you know, discussion, kind of like, here's a presentation on what Salsa is and that kind of thing. Was there anything else there? Yep. And then, yeah, there was a ton of talks on Salsa at Open Source Summit and OpenSSF Day. There was the panel. There was the deep dive into sort of the actual technical stuff, and want to thank Ian and Laurent from the Ghost team. I used their npm builder as the beta builder to show off to folks, because folks were also asking for straightforward examples. I think a lot of folks were asking the tooling, you know, for tooling like, hey, is there tooling for Team City? Is there tooling for all these other things? And I recommended that they join the tooling group and help us build that out. The other things were also, there was some feedback from a couple of there's some folks from the various ecosystems, like packaging systems there. There seemed to be still some interest in like, how do we distribute Salsa metadata? And maybe is there a way to distribute it relatively in sync with the rest of the ecosystems so that we don't end up having to build tools that like specific support that is hard to build for, Maven Central, for PyPI, for Gem, etc. That was another thing. What else? A lot of interest is also yeah, that's about it. And then Chris also had some great talks on, and I'll hand it over to him.
Yeah. So I'm actually, I must admit, I joined about 10 minutes late. I had trouble getting a conference room. But the feedback I got sounded very different to the feedback the rest of you got, which was primarily positive, and much less concerned with confusion and concerned about how you will track like SLSA. I mean, my talks are SLSA conformant, so that's what people talked about. But they wanted to know, how do you know that you're doing SLSA? What will audits look like? Who will be auditors? I guess I was hearing from the people who don't care about the particular requirements and more about about what it looks like for the business overall. What I did hear about tooling was generally positive towards the GitHub Actions, but looking for support from other ecosystems. What else? Yeah, I mean, I could go into more specifics. It seems about 50% of people hate the idea of self-attestation of SLSA level. 50% of people hate the idea of third-party audits. So I assume we're doing something right.
But how much overlap was it? If 100% of people are okay with either, then maybe we're good. But if 100% of people like hate both, then that's no good.
I don't recall at the moment.
I mean, if you look at PCI, I used to QFA, there's going to be the big orgs who want to self-cert, and then there's going to be people who don't want to or can't. But I think you just need to make both available.
So this is something I just so happen, like, because I saw a similar feedback. I didn't get nearly as much as Chris did, but the folks that I saw, and this is the same way I found with pretty much any one of these requirements, is if you are the one saying I'm SLSA compliant or conformant, you obviously just want to self-certify. If you are somebody who's consuming that, you want to say, no, I don't want to just consume somebody's self-assessment. I want them to go through an audit. So I think the thing I always find is folks who are consuming SLSA want everybody else to go through audits. And if you are the one who is producing SLSA, you want to just say, yeah, of course I'm SLSA. Here's my self-assessment. I think I think around that. I also think that, a lot of that is like when you sit down with folks and you just sort of say, hey, you still get to trust who you want to trust, I think is important, as an important piece that I think folks are. I know one of the other things that kind of came out of that was folks were trying to figure out, like, if I am a big financial firm, who do I trust? I don't know. That's why I want these audits, because at least if you go through an audit of, from some big audit firm, yeah, I trust that big audit firm, or I trust OpenSSF to certify these audit firms to be, SLSA conformance audit compliant, or whatever it is, right? I think that sort of thing is something that folks are looking at. I think still, though, different companies are just going to say, yeah, I don't trust small company X, because even if they did get an audit, I just don't trust that, they're small and whatever, and, I don't trust them, or whatever it is. And then other companies would be like, yep, this is a giant company, and I think generally they do the right things, and I trust them.
Right, which reminds me, the other feedback I got was about the, I guess, the economics of auditing. The question is, who pays for it? What are fees like? And to be honest, I don't really think that that's necessarily I don't think that's our decision. but just explaining that to people was worthwhile.
Yeah, so I agree. I think there's something interesting because we are coming in slightly different, right? Where like, you know, if you go to PCI or some of these other things that are quite a bit more strict, and it comes in from I'm trying to think of how to explain it. It's just like there is, I guess, like when you talk about PCI compliance, right? PCI compliance comes with pretty hefty fines if it turns out you broke the rules, especially if you're like, you know, if you had a data breach and you were taking credit card information. Whereas I think right now, at least when it comes to SLSA, there is none of that. That might get codified in people's contracts, but we'll see. Cool. So I think that was all of I think that was all open source summit. What else? And then I think the general thing for this was prioritizing new work. A lot of the feedback I know that just sort of gathering from a lot of different folks was it seemed like a lot of folks were asking about source track. A lot of folks were asking about also something like a build L4, right? A lot of folks, you know, there was some feedback, actually, I forgot to mention in there. And I know it's something that we've been clearing up with folks is a lot of people were still like, where did the hermetic requirement go? Where did the reproducible requirement go? Are you taking security features out because they weren't popular or whatever, and you're, you know, bowing to corporate interests? Is like, no, it's just that people couldn't agree what hermetic meant. So come join us to build out what the draft level 4 means, which is big. And then separately, people are asking for, you know, because I think the people are sort of saying, hey, now that I'm doing the build, but you're telling me that the build could produce malware, what can I start to do from the source code perspective to start to track that? And then a third thing was that build system requirement. Like, what does a SLSA compliant build system actually look like? And are there requirements that we can specify or even point people in the direction of? Like, I'm just sort of, you know, throwing it out there, right? Where there's like a lot of different CI sort of security frameworks. Could you point, you know, could SLSA say, hey, while we're building out our own, take a look at this. This seems pretty reasonable.
Yeah, I guess the big thing is like having people start to do it. So I feel like the three main things, I think we're pretty clear that the three biggest areas to start work on within the specification, like not counting the tooling or the conformance program, is addressing our now growing list of feedback. And I think there's not really anything blocking that other than just people spending, you know, one of us spending time on that. And then fleshing out the source track and the next build level.
Is there a scratch pad that if somebody wanted to build out the next level that they should do it to not affect the 1.0? Should we create a latest, a dev directory?
I'm glad that you mentioned that. Tianu is here. I think the biggest blocker to that, I mean, like, I don't think anyone stops anyone from just creating a fork and doing that, because most of the hard work is more thinking work and then writing work. The actual translating it to Markdown is like the most straightforward piece. So I think people could do it now if they're not blocked. But Tianu has been working on a proposal to like split up restructure repo, which we've talked about before, around having like branches for each version. And then we could kind of work in a branch and display it like that. Tianu, do you want to say more?
Yeah, so I'm working on a doc, and then I'm now getting feedback and then trying to trying to build some proof of concept myself. So once that doc looks good to me, I will once that doc I get enough feedback, I will commit a markdown version to the, I think, one of the SLSA proposal report, so that I can get like a wider feedback. But in general, like I think going forward, people can work on some branch, and then the GitHub action could just automatically build and deploy to the website. But be patient. Let me finish the doc, and then I will publish publicly.
So yeah, I think if anyone in the meantime wants to start on that, I think just creating a branch for now, fork or branch or whatever, not committing to main, would be the way to go, and just like, create like section headers or whatever, and like we could just start to iterate on what the ideas are, or alternatively use like Google Doc or HackMD or whatever other collaboration format for doing. Because I think right now we're still kind of in the idea phase of like what should the levels look like. Previously we had like for the source for the original version, we had nothing, I think, at level 0, at level 1, and then like verified identity and retaining the source code at level 2, and then two-party review, I think, at level 3. But like it's not at all clear to me that those should be the levels. Like we probably, for example, want a source level 1 that's something other than nothing. But like kind of like fleshing out that, like, what are the actual requirements? If retention is a thing, what does that mean? Or does that go in like some sort of dependency track? Or who retains it? Is it the source owner, or is it the actual build system, or is it the consumer? Yeah, kind of fleshing out those ideas. I think that's where we're at this point.
Cool. Yeah, no, I agree with you there. And I think the thing that actually came off really well in some of the blogs we've done and some of the other information we've done was sort of in how we've encapsulated build as the inputs, the build, and the outputs. And like, that's what it is. And so stuff like the source code itself would be the responsibility of a source code track, but the build would just be responsible to say, hey, I am pulling down this source code and this is what I recorded. And that sort of thing, which I thought was really useful, because I think a lot of folks were kind of, which helped out between v0.1 and 1.0, was folks were getting confused by like, hey, I just run the build system and now you're telling me I need to be responsible for how source code is 2-person code reviewed. Like, that doesn't make sense to me. Whereas here now it's nice and encapsulated. So the person, usually I would say, the build system is owned by a team or an organization. And sometimes the same team and organization owns both, but in many cases that's not true. And it also lets folks sort of pick and choose, right? Where, yeah, the basic idea, I think, being people are very interested in keeping those things somewhat granular, so that they can say, yeah, I don't own the build system, but I can be SLSA level 4, conformant with this sort of thing. And I think that helps out a lot, because especially within certain organizations, you're going to have different people able to perform different actions, be able to do certain things.
So I think that makes sense if you're trying to differentiate between the build track versus a source track. But I think that there is still cross dependencies and cross requirements between producers and build systems across the different tracks. Like maybe there's some level of taking the source track and taking the two-person code review where you have like the producers have associated or have set up two-person reviews, and then some higher level is the build platform verifies and enforces that review.
Yeah, sorry. Agreed there. And in fact, actually, the way I was thinking it conceptually in my head, and feel, this is just a basic idea, is I think it would be really nice to eventually have the build track say, yeah, like let's say just for example, SLSA level 4, with SLSA level 4, you should be accepting SLSA level, like as part of your build, you should be only ingesting SLSA source track level 3 or whatever, right? Like you can say, hey, look, as a producer, you should be verifying that you are getting from the source code something that hits a certain SLSA source track level, something like that.
Are you saying that it's some kind of meta SLSA build or some meta SLSA track?
Yeah, I don't want to get it too deep into where the wording might come in, but yeah, something like that, where I could imagine that as we begin to go up and up in SLSA, somebody might say, hey, SLSA build gives me one thing, SLSA source gives me another thing, but SLSA source plus build gives me something better, right? And this is something I know we had discussed early on, is that like the build is obviously one piece, like the build component itself is just one piece of a larger picture. There's something that each of those things like source and build give you, but then if you were to combine, source, build, dependencies, and packaging and publishing or whatever, and deployment, all of those things kind of give you something much more. But I know folks were kind of, the big feedback we had gotten from a lot of folks is like, hey, we can't do it all. How do we kind of encapsulate it better? And so on.
In terms of mechanically, like for the original question, like how do we, someone get started, make sure we're not like stepping on each other's toes or something like that. I think just if anyone starts wanting to work on this, just send a message either on GitHub issues or on Slack or something, just saying that. That way, if other people are working, you could say, hey, I'm working on it too, and then people could work together. Anything else? Going once, going twice. Okie doke. All right, well, it's good seeing everybody. Thanks, Mike, for giving the great feedback again from another summit. I really appreciate that. Thanks, everyone, for joining. See you next time.